what we have planned for you today is slightly different than a general, session. We want this to be as participatory rather than just listening to us talk for the entire 1 hour. And I'll tell you the reason. Um, on behalf of IMLS, we of course try to share best practices where the agency's direction and strategic priorities are, but we also take these opportunities as a listening opportunity, so that if we are missing something in terms, especially in terms of sector-wide need, this is an opportunity for us. So what we're going to do is, this hour is divided into 2 segments, as I call it. We have chunkatized it. I know there's no word like that. We've chunkatized this into 2 segments. The first segment, each one of us are going to speak for about 10 minutes. I'm going to give like a broad overview, insights from what we are finding out, some gaps that we are seeing, how IMLS has made a digital and explicit focus, and then I'll give examples of some of the national leadership grant projects that are very aligned to what we are seeking. And then, of course, Jessica and Wendy are going to be talking about their IMLS funded project. We'll take briefly, some Q&As. We'll do a Q&A in case you have pertinent questions, either for me or for any of them. And then it's going to be your turn. And we have flip charts out there. And after you've heard everything from us, what we want to do is we want to divvy you up in 2 groups, take the flip charts, and then ideate about the needs, proposed solution, or some collaborative projects that you, as sector representatives, feel. And like I said, we take the input that you provide very seriously, so it'll be very helpful for us to do that. So, okay, so that's the plan. So I'll get going. How many of you already know about IMLS? You've applied, and if you haven't, we are the primary source of federal funding for the nation's libraries and museums. As per the FY19 appropriation, we received $242 million. Bulk of that funding goes to grants to state for the libraries. And then the remaining is divvied up between the library office and the museum office. And in terms of discretionary grant, the good news is that the museum side has actually more than the library side. So which is, as I say, that we love to get more money to give away more money. And even though you can think about these times as being challenging, we've actually received 3 million more in the last few years. So, that shows that the work that all of you are doing is making an impression, and, that folks value, the decision makers and the stakeholders value the contributions of museums and libraries. So that's the good news. And of course, in terms of eligibility, museums, of course, can apply, but they have to meet X number of criteria that we have. But many times we find that people don't know that if you're a nonprofit, or if you're a foundation, or a university, you are also eligible to apply, and that is in the National Leadership Grant category. So that is something that oftentimes when we are presenting, we see these expressions on people's faces, oh, we didn't know we could even apply to IMLS. So that's something that we always highlight. And the current level of OMS funding for the FY19 year was $34.7 million, so which is a pretty large chunk, So in terms of a quick overview of the museum grant programs, we traditionally used to have 4 grant programs: Museums for America, which is about $20 million, and only museums can apply to that program. The National Leadership Grant for museums, like I mentioned, is open to museums and other institutions. Relatively smaller pool of money, because this is also a pool where we fund many cooperative agreements. And then we have a dedicated program called the Museum Grant for African American History and Culture, which was actually put together. It's in its 14th year now. And it was part of the same legislation that led to the formation of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And then we have the Native American and Native Hawaiian Museum Services Program, and that is only open to federally recognized tribes. So even if you are a Native American Cultural Center, that is not a program to apply, because that's only open for federally recognized tribes. Native American cultural centers can apply to any of the other grant categories. So this was sort of the landscape, and then I know I joined in 2016 as the deputy director, and as a practitioner prior to joining, IMLS in this capacity, I was with the Henry Ford Museums in Dearborn, Michigan, and again, in my entire career has been in museums and other nonprofits. And I saw as a practitioner the dire need for funding for professional development. And that is something that gets compromised as the first item from operational budgets. And even in large institutions, as new trends like STEM and 3D printing and all these are evolving, the current staff may not have those skills. And I have seen museum staff patching up and trying to be, but not really having the thing. And this was something I like to be bold. And this was 2016 when it was being proposed that IMLS along with NEH and NEA were going to be eliminated. I'm a one-pager person. I said, we have to, rather than wait for new monies to come, we have Museums for America. Can we take a portion of that and dedicate it to a professional development program? And what I did is, I'm a one-pager person, laid out the what that would do, and went up to our grants management and our general counsel who keep, check of how it can be done. And within like 3 or 4 months, the Office of Management Budget approved, this Museums Empowered program. And it's a program that is focused on professional development, not just for like attending conferences or doing a workshop or bringing a consultant. It is, again, chunkatized into 4 categories, which is digital technology, diversity and inclusion, evaluation, and organizational management. So if you're really thinking of changing the culture in your organization, and lo and behold, the first year we launched this, the number of applications that came in, and what we are funding is so gratifying because it's really substantive, cross-cutting, systemic change that the institutions are asking the money for. And this is the 4th year now that we are funding this, and we have been able to give $3 million from MFA into this. And then last year, we launched Inspire Grants for Small Museums because we were finding, you go to conferences and small museums say, oh, IMLS is not for us. And we said, no, it is for you. Oh, it's too overwhelming. So we created this program, which is specifically for small museums. It's only up to $50,000, which, as you know, is actually quite a good amount of change. And we simplified the process, and the small museums do not have to come up with a match, which is a huge thing, which is a huge difference. So again, over 200 applications the first year. And so, these are the changes. And in addition to the discretionary grants where you all apply for, if IMLS finds that there is a sector-wide need that is not being met by the projects that we are funding, then we take the initiative to launch a cooperative agreement where we seek cooperators or experts or an institution that is doing some significant work. And so, for example, MAP is a cooperative agreement we have had with the American Alliance of Museums for the longest time. CAP, Collections Assessment Program. We have the accessibility program called Museums for All with the Children's Museum Association, and sort of the list goes on. And this is also an area where you might not know that IMLS can actually accept monies from other federal agencies. We got $1.9 million from the Department of Education to scale up a STEM and making. I know the year that I had joined, as a board member, I knew that it got funded 1 year, and the second year, they said, oh, we didn't get the funding. And I'm like, how can that be? We just started this pilot, so we made the case again. We not only got the second round of money, which was $750,000. I always believe in, hey, ask. If they don't give, they'll tell you no. And I told the Department of Ed, if you really want IMLS and the museums to make a big impact, we need more monies. And they said, how much do you need? And I said, double of what we got. And they gave us $1.9 million. And now it's expanding to 8 states all across the nation. So that's just an example of that. So the synthesized insights from IMLS-funded digital projects. So like I mentioned, when I came on board, we wanted to know what IMLS is funding, right? Every year we get these 900 plus grants, And I'm a big believer in data-based decision making. So my staff now know if Paula is asking for internal scan and data, oh, there it comes again. But it's really helpful for us. So we did an internal scan of anything digital that IMLS has funded in the last 5 years across all our programs, right? Across all the programs that I talked about. And here are some of the insights. In terms of discipline, and this might not be a surprise for all of you, art museums followed by history museums have received the highest number of grants for digital projects. The second thing is, in terms of types of projects, the majority of the funded digital projects are for traditional digital asset management program. We are digitizing X number of objects, which is very important, but bulk, more than 65% of the 400 projects are collections management, kind of program. Some are for educational technology and some are, combination. So again, this really gave us an insight of where the gaps are, and where the field is moving. Thankfully, because we are museums and libraries, we also get to see what libraries are doing and what museums are not catching up on. So again, being a funding agency, we have the power of the nudge that we can provide. The other finding was that the projects are less focused on use and deployment of the digital assets, especially in collections-based organizations. The only way they say it's done is if they find out that we put it on website and it's available for anyone, but really not productizing it or doing it. And then the last is, in terms of size of museums, small and medium institutions are significantly lagging behind. So some of the other broad takeaways on current gaps is lack of or minimal number of projects. And please note that I'm providing you this information from the lens of IMLS funded projects. Does not mean that this is not happening elsewhere. There are very few projects that are focusing on building sector-wide networks, common platform, or cross-cutting or adaptable tools. There are very few projects that are based on collaborations within the museum sector. Actually, at this conference, I was pretty happy to see some good examples, but still the museum sector is not engaging in partnership in a cross-sector manner. Museums and libraries, museums and others. It's still not happening at the scale that we would want. There is really a lack of research, studies, and data that can shed light on the state of digital affairs. Now, people might say that's too big of a research project. Then why can't we have research in certain segments? It can be divvied up rather than trying to take the whole. There is very few projects that support mentorship for small institutions who are lagging behind. This just goes on and on and on unless we do something. Very few projects that are focusing on professional development or network opportunities for small and mid-sized institutions who cannot attend the existing conferences. And I won't say further, I think you all know what I mean. Some ambiguity on who's doing OER, open education resources. There's a big movement going on. We are doing online education, but we are not using the nomenclature of OER. And then last but not the least, minimal use of evolving technologies, such as crowdsourcing, MOOCs, use of big data. Our field and the sector of what we are funding is very, very traditional. And technology is something which is moving at fast pace, but we are still doing some things very, So what did we do? So like I said, apart from giving grants, we listen, we reflect, we amplify, we coalesce, we guide, and we try to catalyze. So what has IMLS done in the recent years, just in last 4 years, to address the gap and opportunities in the realm of everything digital, right? So we launched, we refocused OMS funding opportunities by launching this new grant program called Museums Empowered in 2017, and that has an explicit subcategory of funding for training museum staff in digital technology. We increased the cap of funding for this program for 150,000 to 250,000 because we wanted the projects to be substantive. Specific language, I'm not going to go through all of this because this is all in our notice of funding opportunities. But what we find is when IMLS makes these changes, I've written bulk of all this new language that's in the NOFOs. People sometimes just miss what IMLS is looking for. Digital technology projects may include, but are not limited to, effective and efficient users of technology, fellowships, internships, and mentoring programs to attract and retain a tech-savvy workforce and cross-train museum staff, develop strategies for enhancing staff capacity to use. So, all of these examples of what IMLS is looking for is in the NOFO. And I know that it's an 80-page document, and oftentimes people miss out. But from our end, we are encouraging you to focus in on these needs to actually increase your chances of getting the funding, because we get 900 applications, only 1/3 gets funded. Changes in the National Leadership Grant for Museums. I know when I joined, I said, how is NLG different than MFA? They had the same 3 categories: collections, learning, community. And the types of projects that we would fund, 300 to 400, would almost look exactly the same. Now, NLG has been totally revamped, along with, there are 5 subcategories, but 1 explicitly focused on digital platforms and applications. Again, broad. And then we increased the cap for NLG from 500K to $1 million. Again, nudging the field to dream big, come up with substantive projects. And again, it's very rewarding to see, we used to almost get 0 digital applications under NLG. And now that whole thing is finally changing. Of course, the highest numbers are still for diversity and inclusion. So again, I'm not going to go into details because of time, but very specifically, if it's an NLG grant, what are we looking for? Shared system, open source technologies, tools and technologies that enable people of all backgrounds and abilities to discover the museum's collection, new digital learning resources, new media communication tools, emerging educational trends such as open education resources, blended and flipped classroom. All of this is all in there. So 3 quick examples of national leadership grants. We launched a big project called Museums for Digital Learning. We actually did a session yesterday with a full house. This is basically, we have brought together 3 large institutions: Newfields, the Indianapolis Museum of Art, the Field Museum, and History Colorado, with the hope of building one shared platform where museums can contribute their digital assets and learning resources as a one-stop shop. And again, this is to, the audience is K through 12, but the focus is to build the capacity of the museum sector. If it's small and medium-sized museums who are not doing it, we can always leave them behind, or we can at least try to raise the bar. So this is really exciting for us. And then we just funded this year Games for Change, which is really introducing, this project is going to teach the education staff of museums in 5 cities gaming techniques of how to develop. So it's a professional development where Games for Change as a nonprofit organization will go and train and teach, and it's a pilot. We funded Lawrence Hall of Science on a big research on augmented reality and how families are interacting with. And these are pretty large. This one, if I'm not wrong, is close to an $800,000 project. But this research is going to really help the field, rather than just experimenting with augmented reality, what is really the impact of who you're trying to engage. And last but not the least, Your Story, Our Story for the East Tenement Museum. Fascinating project, small museum, taking this big project of crowdsourcing, content on immigration stories from scholars and curators and the public. And it's just fascinating. They were supposed to be here, but they couldn't make it. So just to give you an example of the gaps, how we have moved it, and what we are starting to see. And I will. Games for Change is the organization, right? And they were already working with a couple of cities, and we said, how can this be, replicated and expanded? And they came back with a proposal, and got really good rating. So I will turn it over. I'm sure I've gone over my time, but there was a lot to pack. But I will turn it over to Jessica.
Okay, I think I'm going to speak without the microphone. I have a pretty loud voice. Let me know if you can't hear me. Let's see if this is working. Great. So I'm going to talk about a 2-year IMLS Museums Empowered grant that Mingei International Museum, we actually just completed the grant cycle. The work goes on forever. We are not done, but the grant cycle just ended about a month ago. And I included just some language on this slide from an initial report that the Balboa Park Online Collaborative, many of you might know Nick Honeysett in BPOC, we had engaged them to do an initial assessment of how we were and weren't using digital platforms and tools, and what our workflow looked like internally, and where we might find some room for improvement. And you'll see in this quote, which I think we put directly into the grant application, there was some room for improvement. So we proceeded with an ask for a digital transformation grant from Museums Empowered. So just quickly, for those of you in the room who don't know anything about our museum, who is a Mingei? What is a Mingei? Mingei International Museum, just to get a sense of our size, we're located here in San Diego in Balboa Park. We're a museum of folk art, craft, and design. I've added a few objects from our collection onto some of these slides so you can get a chance of what we're about and what we show. We have about a $4 million annual operating budget, about 45 staff full and part-time, about 110,000 visitors a year. Caveat, none of that's true right now because we are closed to the public for a major renovation. So our staff is a little bit smaller, our operating budget is a little bit smaller, but this gives you an idea of our size museum. We're not a huge group. The project, again, I lifted this language directly from the grant application so that you could all see what this is. The project was a digital transformation to align with what was our major transformation of our facility, which is ongoing. And you can see the slide says this project will work from the inside out, first internally building our staff capacity, our internal digital literacy and workflow and processes, really in order to better serve our visitors and to reach a broader audience. Oxygen mask theory, we first had to help ourselves so that we could be there for our audience. This is really, really important. Why did we do it? Well, we were stressed. We were facing the closure of our museum for at least a year. Shocker, it turns out it's going to be over 2 years. And we were worried. Our digital platforms, with the closure of our facility, our digital platforms were about to become the first, the most important way that people would engage with us. No more people just discovering Mingei because they happened to be a tourist in Balboa Park and they wandered into our facility. They had to go looking for us. We had to be pushing out our information, and frankly, our digital platforms were not equipped for this, and we realized that. Our website needed a revamp. Our social media was challenging due to problems with our workflows and access to some of our digital content assets. And back to that quote from the BPOC report on that very first slide, our process and workflows had evolved, based on staffing and staffing limitations, technology workarounds, silos, individual preferences, all the things we deal with in our workplaces, right? And no one's to blame. It's just how things have evolved and happened. You've had a lot of people doing things one way for a long time. I don't know if any of you attended that session that several women from the Getty did about the mapping the content flows. Had we done ours, it would have been filled with red dots. There were a lot of pain points. And again, Nick and BPOC helped elicit some of those in their initial assessment of what we were doing. We were also rebranding. We were working on a new strategic plan. We were approaching this time of really significant institutional change. And we knew we had an opportunity. I would say most important, we also on staff had one superhero thought leader who really pushed us. And she's not here right now, but she did present yesterday on our website, Alexis O'Banion, who really said, I want to try to change the culture here. I really believe we can do this. And this was an example of someone really leading from the middle and pushing the rest of us to come along and get on board with her vision. And I think that's really significant, and I want to acknowledge that. We were lucky to have that kind of person in our midst. So how did we do it? So here's the formula at the top here. We have our one superhero thought leader. We have one brilliant organizational partner, BPOC. They were really aligned with us throughout. We had a great funder in IMLS. I mean, to be able to find funding for this kind of, combination of professional development and the build out of technology infrastructure was so essential. And we had buy-in and support from management. It was going to take time to get buy-in and support from everyone else on staff. This is ultimately a story of organizational change and culture change. But we had, the people at the top of the organization, myself included, saying, we're going to do this, okay? So how did we do it? Again, we look at these 4 steps, the assessment from BPOC of our workflows really helped guide us. So we started off with our tools and our infrastructure. And, Alexis could tell you more. She's probably floating around here somewhere after the session about how we leveraged some simple out-of-the-box products. I mean, Google Drive, Airtable, Slack. We also used Craft as the CMS for our beautiful new website, and Stacy Edelstein, who designed that, can tell you more about it if you're curious. They presented on our website yesterday. But once we identified the tools that we knew we wanted to leverage and invest in, we also looked at how our human resources were deployed, just as important. And here's a great example. One of the big challenges that we identified in our workflow as a big pain point was access to images. We have all these digital images, but photography, editing, storage of images, it was just an absolute mess. We had all these different departments who had money squirreled away to hire their own freelance photographers for different projects, all of whom delivered their final product in different formats. And they were being stored in different places, and no one could ever find what they needed. And poor Alexis had kind of tried to take on the project, but she became a bottleneck because it was just too much and it was unwieldy, and no one was invested in aligning around a common process. I think that, there was also kind of this myth that we couldn't find one single photographer that we could hire who could shoot objects and gallery space and people at parties and artists at work. Like, this could never happen. But we decided to give it a shot. We pulled together a cross-departmental, team of people to review portfolios that were submitted for a part-time position that we created. And we found that unicorn. His name is Ron. And he's now on staff. And now all of our images are edited, they're categorized, they're saved in one place, they're accessible on the G Drive. Everyone can get what they need. And we pooled all those freelance resources and little pockets of money that everyone had kind of secretly typed into their budget to add someone to the staff who could bring some unity and just some ease to our work. We also partnered with Stacy's company Raygun to build a new website. And again, I won't go into it too much, but I encourage you to take a look, mingay.org. And we improved our workflow using Airtable as a single source of information for a variety of things. Exhibition schedule, the program and event information, and this content, these updates feed directly into our website, CMS Craft. So we can update information in most cases in one place, one time. Anyone can do it, and we know we have a single source of truth. I don't know if this is a problem. The single source of truth is always hard to get at when we're dealing with information. Another great example of that. So our exhibition schedule used to be created and handed out in a Word document as a hard copy, like at all staff meetings. And God help you if you missed the meeting where the updated one was handed out. You were screwed. You were working from the wrong schedule, and you had no way of knowing. And so, that's now in Airtable. It gets automatically updated to the website. There is transparency and universal access to that information. This is such a small change, but such a meaningful one. It transformed the way we work together. We also created a new position for a content producer, and Ashley, who's in that role right now, is here. And now that we have easily accessible images and program content, it's much easier for Ashley to push out timely and relevant social posts, e-blasts, website updates. Our public-facing digital platforms are now much more robust and engaging because we have access to the timely content to get on there. You know, we still have a long way to go, but we've come a long way, and we're seeing growth in our digital audience, and really much more audience in real life while we're closed than we anticipated going into this. We really are operating offsite with exhibitions and programs and events in many different locations, and people are finding us. They're figuring out where we are and how to get there. So that's great. When did this take place? So as I said, it was a 2-year project. The grant cycle just wrapped in September 2019. We began 1 year prior to the museum closure, again, with that equipment and tools, the training and the capacity building on staff. You know, Airtable, Slack, even using the Google Drive required a lot of staff training, which is ongoing. And, you know, there was a lot of anxiety and many challenging aspects to getting people comfortable and using those tools regularly. We're mostly there with most people, which I consider to be a win, and we are measuring this, you know, with some surveys that we've been doing throughout to assess comfort and capacity in using some of these tools. It's worth noting, I think, so you can see in year 2, kind of going into streamlining our workflow. It's when we launched the new website, starting to improve our email and social strategies. It's worth noting that at the end of year 1, we had to move all 26,000 objects in our permanent collection out of the museum and into a warehouse about 10 miles away from the museum. And Alexis worked really closely with our collections and registration team to leverage Airtable to track, inventory, and barcode the entire collection move. This was a daunting task. No one knew how to approach it. We used a brand new tool, and, you know, with a lot of support from the team at Airtable, we're able to make it work. I mean, this was really a game changer for us and for Airtable, who's turned it into a really nice case study that they've published. But really important, and this goes back to changing the culture, this was a huge win for the entire team. And once, you know, the people who worked on the project saw it come to life and be realized, and the rest of the staff started to see this happen, to see a new digital tool deployed in such a successful, meaningful way, I think we really built faith, we built trust, and we really increased the number of stakeholders who got on board with this digital transformation. It was, I think, a real important moment for the whole institution. So, wait, let me just see if I said everything I wanted to say there. I did, yeah. So, what did we learn? Let me discuss that. Anxiety is real. There was a lot of anxiety. This, again, is a story primarily about people and our organizational culture and how people deal with and adapt to change. You know, I'm someone who loves change, but that's not true of everyone, and it's not wrong to feel differently. We need to account for where everyone is on the spectrum of comfort, and this was part of our pre, mid, and post-evaluation strategy there. And at the same time, we had to push forward with this really necessary evolution to the way that we work. You know, I mean, I sat in staff meetings early on where I heard people say, oh my God, Slack is just, I will never use it. It's like an endless text thread, I can't, no, I'm not doing it. Slack is now central, I would say all caps essential, to the way we work together and communicate as a staff. And guess what? Everyone uses it. Everyone got on board. Once people realized they could upload photos of their dogs and their kids, they were all into it. And it's really made a big difference for us. Back to that exhibition calendar, it was a small change that made a big difference. Just bringing transparency to that, getting it onto a live digital platform where it would always be up to date and accurate, it made such a big difference. None of us can do this work alone. Our partners, BPOC, Raygun, our friends at Airtable, they were all fantastic partners, and we've learned so much from them, and it just made everything feel more doable to have a network of different perspectives and organizations and people to help us get the work done. Always good to reflect on what didn't work, what we learned. People are people. We all, myself included, are slow to change in many ways and accept new realities. Silos still exist. We're always going to be dealing with that. But we've also, again, I want to say, made a lot of progress. And I think, you know, we had to aim high for the long haul and know that this is just, it's iterative work. It can be slow work, but we are moving the needle. I would also say that we really are still, I think, a little over-reliant on our superhero and worker bee, who really probably needs a vacation. And that's something to be really mindful of, I think. And you know, it was one of the reasons we wanted to do this work in the first place, right? You don't want to get in a situation where you're totally dependent on the one staff member who understands that one system or piece of technology you use. And I think, again, you know, we're getting more and more people comfortable, trained, you know, bringing forth their own ideas and vision for how we can leverage these platforms to improve, but it's slow going, and I still worry that we're a little over-reliant. One last thing to add here, which is that we now also are institutionalizing the allocation of resources toward digital. And this is a really important shift, right? Our funding cycle has ended. We were so fortunate, but we need to institutionalize and prioritize that funding to continue investing in our digital platforms, in our staff training, and in the next thing. So maybe we'll be going into another grant application soon. So just, you know, thanks to everyone, IMLS, BPOC. Can always email Alexis and I if you have any questions, and Stacy too. And that's it from me.
Great. Wendy.
We're going to go up, right?
Yeah, Wendy has 10 minutes because we want to hear from you too. Sorry.
All right.
I know.
So quickly, our project, Opening Up Digital Collections Learning Resources for Middle School, is a Museums for America project. And I'll tell you, I'm not a digital person. And so for me, coming to a digital solution is really because there's two opportunities at play. And one, as Paula mentioned, is there's a lot of digitization of collections already out there, whether it's IMLS funded or the National Science Foundation is funding a gazillion things too. iDigBio, you can see they list 121 million records. Only 31 million of them have media though, okay? And so even our own Related Research Museum has a lot of collections online. But if you look at that, that doesn't make sense to any of us in this room. Like, that is not actually a useful product. And so what I'm interested in is the idea that it's open to the public, but it's not really useful. And so I feel like there is this opportunity to figure out how to make it useful for teachers and students in middle school. The second opportunity that came from this is that we have been doing teacher workshops with the collections with middle school teachers. And in particular, this is a workshop that was part of something larger where the activity they're doing is it a snake? How many science people are here? Okay, so most of you may not realize that there are all these things that look like snakes. They're long and skinny without legs, but they do have bones inside them, but they're not snakes. And so for us, this activity is kind of a classic middle school sort of thing where they're collecting evidence through the idea of observations, using that evidence to make a claim and showing their reasoning about why what they have in front of them is a snake or not a snake. And this was great, and we had a good time with it. But as you can imagine, because these teachers are here pulling stuff out of collections, that's not very reproducible. It's not something we can actually invite middle schoolers in to go down into the collections and do this. So for me, this is why a digital solution made sense. So we have 4 activities in development, and each of them kind of use digital in a slightly different way. And that's important for me because I kind of want to play around with how to make that all work. So the first project is it a snake? So for the digital version of this, we're using images and 3D scans that you can twist around from collections for kids to do that same claim, evidence, reasoning stuff that we had the teachers doing, but doing it all online. And in case you're curious, the thing on the right is in fact a snake. The one on the left is not a snake. It's a type of legless lizard. I could talk more about that, but I don't think I should. The next activity is we're calling the natural history of frogs. And so in that, we've been 3D printing frogs and hand painting them, because you may not realize the wide variety of frog shapes that exist out there. And so again, this is a project we've done with teachers before, but in this case, it's about having these things actually out in the classroom, kids being able to look at it and make an argument about what type of habitat a frog like this lives in, and how is it that they survive in that. The third activity, discerning environmental change through herbarium specimens, has a little bit of work, but it's based on research that a faculty member is doing, because these herbariums, these plant-based collections, last hundreds of years, and so you can go back and look at both flowering time as well as insect damage and use that as a way to think about environmental change. And then the fourth and final one, teeth, toes, and temperature, climate change and forest evolution, uses 3D printed fossils, I didn't bring any of them, of horse teeth over the past 30 million years to kind of think about what features you see and can actually measure on these horse teeth to, again, make that claim about what the habitat was like at that point in time, and how you can see environmental change based on this. This project for me is interesting because this is not our original project. This comes out of something the University of Florida, but we're adapting it down to middle school, and we're adding a layer with a graduate student who studies horse evolution near us. So this is the whole project timeline. We're in phase 1 and phase 2. Where in phase 1 we're developing these activities, we're printing the frogs, we're thinking about how to do all those pieces along with the supporting videos. Almost concurrently, we have a group of 5 teachers who are working with us to make sure we're on the right path, to make sure what we're doing really would work in their middle school classrooms. Because by the spring, we'll be running a set of 4 teacher workshops, hopefully with about 80 teachers in it, where we can train local teachers throughout the state to do these projects. Because the third year is about implementation and evaluation, and having these teachers do it in their classroom, and our evaluators working with the teachers to see how it's going and what sort of final tweaks that we should do. We're in year 1 of year 3. But so far, some of the lessons learned is that collaboration across many groups is hard, and it takes a lot of time. And just the amount of time it takes to get more than one teacher in the room at one time, and how do we manage that, and can we Skype with these other teachers, has sucked up way more time than I thought would be true. And personally, I really think a lot about balancing the access to the collections with how much of a framework for a learning we're doing. So I love the 3D printed frogs, but the reality is that kids are not going into the collection to see this, right? They're either borrowing a set from us, or their teachers are pulling the files and printing them at their own school. And so as much as this is a real frog in the collection, kids may or may not realize that. Many thanks to one of our educators who's doing most of the work on this, as well as all the scientists and staff around us, and our partner teachers, and to IMLS to fund this. I wanted to really quickly share about a minute of one of the videos. This is in our herpetology collection, so the amphibians and reptiles, and our collection manager, and you'll see one of our grad students.
A very large number. 3,000 at least. A lot of people look at this collection and say, well, what are we doing with this collection? And we're just storing them. It's just a warehouse. In fact, it is not. The collections are used by scientists, by undergraduates studying reptiles and amphibians, by graduate students doing research in this area, and also professors who want to use it for their classroom. So it gets a tremendous amount of use from what we call our publics. One of the things that has really added to our natural history collections is the fact that they're now available on the internet. You've got digital images that you can actually download.
This is where he and I see it a little differently, but that's good.
Classrooms. And so you can see our collections, and you can see the possibilities in terms of how you can use this information to show what actually exists in herpetology.
Thank you, IMLS. There's a slide that actually gives IMS credit. There we go. Good, all right. All right, and that's where I'm turning it back over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So, these insights, even for us, after funding it, we put up a little blurb on the website that this is what they intend to do. So when we have sessions like these, even though the project is in progress, it really, and like we were talking, share some of the failures that you're going through so that others can learn from them and not repeat it, right? Because that's what it's all about. And, fascinated to hear, the two different projects. One is, that's the crux of Museums Empowered, is cross-cutting transformational change. It's not just one department utilizing the funding for something, and that was a fabulous example. By the way, I should know this, but how much was your grant?
I should know that too. I want to say it was 150,000.
Yeah, and that was the maybe that year when the cap was 150, but imagine what sort of transformational change it did to, and at the time when you needed it. And we always hope to kickstart projects, and you're already working on the sustainability part of it. So that's, makes it, and, fascinating project again, where you are using the 3D technology and, making some of these, so interesting. And going back to the idea of co-creation, your teachers are involved in all phases of it. That's where the shift, really needs to happen. So we have 10 minutes, which is really good. Let's do this. Does anybody have like a burning question that they want to ask me or one of the, and promise that whoever is answering it is going to be brief. Okay. Yes, sir.
My name is Mitch Southern with the Museum of Life and Science in North Carolina. We're a mid-sized science center. My question is, so I came originally from outside the museum industry, and from a kind of a sector that did digital work and innovation in a very iterative fashion, starting with kind of like a hypothesis and then slowly developing something over time and learning from it and trashing it, and et cetera. And so one of the things I've struggled with is how to pursue that kind of structure, or those sorts of nascent ideas within the structures of IMLS and federal granting entities. So I've been an IMLS reviewer now several times, and as well as tried to write some grants. And you need to have everything thought through, beginning to end, and you need to de-risk the entire operation for panelists to like it. And so how does the world of digital, where there are a lot of questions and a lot of risks, and you're not entirely sure what's going to pop out of the back end, how does that fit with this world and with both the big grant opportunities that you described, as well as I know you have some like prototyping?
It's within the national leadership, yeah. So I'll try to answer this as briefly as I can. And of course, we can talk offline as well. We actually did 6 IMLS regional workshops this fall in 6 different cities, and they were 8-hour long. And we basically went through some of these in much more detail. So the quick answer to your question is, if you read the Notice of Funding Opportunities, even if you're, the deadline is next week, right? So even if not for this year, there is a section where there's a blog on stages of maturity. We are encouraging you all to define and talk about the risk. We talk about, is it an exploratory? Is it a pilot? Is it something you're taking from a cross-sector model and you're trying to experiment with it? Or is it something that you have tested, like Wendy has tested this with the teachers, and is it scalable? Or is it a scale-up, right? So I would encourage you to read that blog, because that really, again, hones in on what. And we definitely, we have dialed up the focus on risk and say, talk about the risk, but not just talk about the risk, but how do you intend to mitigate it?
Okay.
And that itself, should be, and we have tweaked the reviewer questions to say, this is what we are asking and this is what you should be looking for. So, it's a very good question, and I feel, and I may be biased, for IMLS is that IMLS, even though we don't give huge amount of funding, IMLS encourages innovation and testing out. And if you have tested, you come back and convince the reviewers. And remember, finally, my director and I make the final decisions after everything comes on. We look for how it's going to really set a best practice example. Games for Change, they applied for the first time ever. And they were like, traditional reviewers were like, oh, no, these, if you're so critical, you really cannot encourage innovation. So that's, sometimes we take that risk. Yes.
I have a question for Jessica.
Mhm.
First of all, congratulations on all of that done within the grant that you just described. It seems like a miracle, and you're here to tell us about
I think it was, yeah.
You had a really interesting takeaway that followed directly from the plenary this morning. You said that now we're starting to change the way we look at the budgets to include more digital. And I just wondered if quickly you could just pull out one or two things that really switched something in the brain or made the nickel drop, whatever the analogy is. Because I think people were looking for that earlier today. And I just wondered if you could put some words on it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the first thing is to just develop a dependence, right? We now can't imagine not working with these tools that have become so central to how we operate. And, at a baseline level, we've got to continue to pay to use those and, add new users to the annual agreement and all of that every year, right? So we've made people kind of dependent and integrated the use of things that now no one wants to go away. I think that in turn builds more openness and trust to trying the next thing, right? And that's something really important. I think, just continuing to make it a part of the discussion. I think that we really were conscious about, every month in an all-staff meeting, reporting on the project, talking, reminding people, oh, by the way, we're in this big IMLS-funded digital transformation project. Remember? This one thing we just talked about is part of that. That, reminding people that certain things are happening because of technology. Technology can become invisible if it's working well, right? But I will now will go back to, if something really great has happened, wow, we weren't able to do that before we had Airtable in place on the staff, that kind of thing. So part of it's just continuing to reinforce the importance of things, and you need that senior leadership buy-in to ensure it's getting into the budget.
Okay, so I think we might have 4 minutes, but I don't know we have time. We don't have time. We just have 4 minutes. From what you heard today, let's have a group discussion, right? One of us will take notes. So Wendy has a book open.
I do.
I do want to take back some notes. From the needs that I sort of shared in terms of the bullets, are there needs that you all feel the sector is facing or you as an institution is facing that I did not capture? And I know those were like broad stroke from synthesis, of that. Anything that comes to your mind, both from an individual, museum's perspective or from a sector perspective, that this is something which is needed but it's not happening? And I know it's really difficult to do it in this short time. My email will be on the last slide, so you can send me. Yes. Please introduce yourself.
I am Matt Tarr. Like Mitch, I'm a board member of MCN. But I'm also the American Museum of Natural History. So a lot of my questions, and I'll email you later, because I think it's about how an organization of our size could sort of benefit and work with you guys to do this stuff. And I really liked what you started to say, which is, this is what I'd like to hear more from, is you guys have some money and you guys want to see change, and that doesn't always filter down because we're so huge that the development folks who are paying attention to your changes on your website, they're not coming to my office and saying, what about this stuff? But they might be the same ideas that we're trying to push,
Right.
So there's I guess the thing that I would be looking for is, because when you do have external funds, you get outsized influence and you can force things. And one of the things that we need to force to be helpful in is busting silos. So you kind of hinted at it, I think, but the way it was written, I was like, oh, that looks great for small and medium-sized organizations to sort of build capacity, whatever. But in our case, building the capacity really involves somehow chipping away at these silos. And you know, if I get Bloomberg money, like $3 million, I can sort of plow across
Right,
silos.
right.
But like maybe there's a way that you can help us, all of us, I should say, not just the big ones, though I think we're most susceptible to the ossification of these silos. So anyway, so that.
And I think that's
you kind of
something that I heard even when we were doing the regional workshops, that folks were saying now we have material to take back and talk to those folks to convince that this is what we have been talking about. And I think they'll be more convinced if they hear that IMLS is interested in this, you know. So again, the challenge that I face, I feel in like conferences, you know, you get like 45 minutes or like 35 minutes to talk, and sometimes when you really want to have these kind of conversation and it doesn't fit into the skeleton of, you know, the program committee, what they're wanting, you're really not having. And even at AAM and other conferences, like you have to define, does this apply to education or collection or whatever, but in the real world change happens across those. And you know, I've talked to Laura a lot to say, I wish there were these, apart from the plenary, there are these sessions where it doesn't matter what department you're in. You know, everybody's talking about, you know, that.
We should do a deep dive next
Yes,
2 hours.
yes. So, my second question is, in terms of supposing, you know, all of you here, and again, we didn't get a chance to really know which institutions you're with. If I give you a problem and say, hearing all these sector-wide, you know, what can be like, let's reduce it from 3 big ideas to 1 big idea. What can be a big collaborative idea where different institutions, doesn't matter if you're a museum or a MCN kind of an association or, you know, some tech companies can come together and say, you know, by next year, by FY 2020, we can actually come up with an IMLS proposal. And I'm saying, you know, it doesn't have to be an IMLS proposal, which will really address this, because that's something that I'm always interested in, is takeaways. And we have seen this work. We convened museum studies programs in 2016. Big aha thing was many of the universities didn't know that they could apply to IMLS. And then the number from the synthesis of that whole day convening, like if there were 5 points that came up, next year and the year after and the year after, we are seeing applications addressing those issues. So that's the kind of thing, you know, it's like, what is your call to action?
One thing I just was thinking, some of your earlier comments, you know, the museum sector is in this like strange place of scale where a lot of vendors don't really care what we want. If we can use something that's already created, like by Microsoft or whatever, like then great. But like we don't really wield enough power or dollars to really move the technology in our direction, and that's why many of us end up recreating wheels, you know, everywhere. And I would say that your comment about museums and libraries together would increase our scale enormously. You know, if there were like, I noticed, you know, libraries are actually getting much more into kind of the museum space, separate from technology even, like they're making, you know, maker spaces, and they're having collections on display, and they're more of a community center. And even like, we heard from Playwrights Horizons yesterday, like even some other adjacent cultural organizations are thinking about using digital in ways that we think about immersion and collection experience. And I feel like the digital realm of what we want to do with our audiences is actually really similar. And if there was any way for that joint to come together and make AR kind of like, just as one example, I'm not saying we should all do AR, but like if it just made it that more accessible for us to understand some kind of simple layer, right? It works for museums and libraries and performing arts, like that
Like the
would be
third space,
phenomenal.
you know,
And I think that someone like your organization could really make that happen.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you now?
Yeah, I just want to sort of like focus it like really, really down to what Claire did 2 years ago now, I guess, with the
Last year.
Compass, which was to take a complicated and obnoxious concept, indoor positioning, and then pull people together from across wherever,
Right.
and sit them in a room for a day and a half and say,
Yeah.
this is what we're going to cover. We should do one. We should do 12,
Yeah.
maybe in partnership with MCN or something. Today, this month it's AR,
Yeah.
and next month it's whatever, but
Yeah.
like
It's
instead
a
of
wicked
everybody-
problem and,
Yeah,
you.
cutting across the silos and somehow getting the people in the room to just focus on that one problem.
Mhm.
And disseminating information, which is
Yeah.
what Claire is really good at.
And that's something that I'm really, again, there's never enough time, and thank you all for, being here. We just launched a multi-year data analysis project. And I'll tell you, Deb, it goes back to what you're talking about, dissemination. So IMLS keeps funding all these wonderful projects. We feature them at conferences. You all submit your reports. The reports get checked as a compliance. They get filed away. The products that come out get filed away, right? So 2 years ago, I said, guys, we have to find out what we are funding to tell better stories to Congress, to everyone, of what IMLS funding is doing. My staff said, that's like too much. Again, chunkatized 12 of them into 6 portfolio groups. Digital technology, collections, learning, all six. Because we find that it's really easy and defined a timeline, 2014 to 18, 5 years. Each of the the groups grouped the awarded funds into these 6. There are 1,200 records. Now we have hired a contractor who's going to take the 1,200 records in next 12 months is going to synthesize findings, both quantitative and qualitative data, and 10 case studies for each theme. And then as part of the project, 250 reports, completed reports, have been pulled together. So there are X number of products that have come out of each, and eventually the hope will be what we have funded will be put up on the website so that, number one, people are not reinventing the wheel, and the second thing is, you can actually, do more. So it's a mega project. We just hired the contractor, and it's going to, in a year,
great to hear.
I know, it's good. Okay, sorry, we should be out of this place very soon. Thank you.